You're listening to episode 318, An Introduction to the Weeds and Seeds of Ministry. Today, we're starting a new series by that very name. Welcome to Transforming Missions Podcast, providing you with insights and resources you need to lead a movement of Jesus followers.
Jesus used seeds as examples in 4 of his parables, the seeds and weeds in Matthew 13, 24 through 30. The sower, seed, and soils in Matthew 13, 3 through 9. It was the seed growing secretly in Mark's Gospel, Mark 4, 26 through 29. And then the mustard seed, Mark 4, 30 through 32. I think we want to start this episode with seeds and weeds from Matthew 13. Sarah, would you read that for us?
Sure. Here is the parable of the weeds and seeds. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like someone who planted good seed in his field. While people were sleeping, an enemy came and planted weeds among the wheat and went away. When the stalk sprouted and bore grain, then the weeds also appeared. The servants of the landowner came and said to him, "Master, didn't you plant good seed in your field? Then how is it that it has weeds?" "An enemy has done this," he answered. The servants said to him, "Do you want us to go and gather them?" But the landowner said, "No, because if you gather the weeds, you'll pull up the wheat along with them. Let both grow side by side until the harvest, and at harvest time I'll say to the harvesters, 'First gather the weeds and tie them together in bundles to be burned, but bring the wheat into the barn.'"
Thanks, Sarah. The scripture is filled with references of seeds, grain, wheat, and we can keep going down the list. What I like about this one is we'll not be burning anything today. But we do want to introduce you to the ministry of weeds and seeds.
So what are these weeds and seeds?
Ministry weeds are things that we all struggle with as pastors and leaders. The weeds are things like being overwhelmed or fear, not having enough time, isolation that can stop us from being and becoming who God created us to be. The weeds tend to choke our effectiveness as leaders and can quickly take over not only our leading, but our lives. Weeds pop up all the time, but as we learn to identify them, we can quickly pluck them and replace them with seeds.
So then you might be asking, so what are the seeds of ministry? The seeds of ministry are the solution, the response, or the antithesis of the weed. The seeds help us to continue to lead well and fuel effective ministry. When we embody practices like equipping others for the work of ministry and building trust, we continue to grow as leaders and serve in ways that honor our calling, honor God, and honor the people that we're leading.
So you might ask, why in the world are you talking about weeds and seeds? Sarah and I were recently asked about what do we hear? What are we seeing? How can pastors continue to lead well and adapt to an ever-changing ministry landscape? And we thought weeds and seeds fit well.
And so as Tim and I talked about situations that we're trying to help a church navigate, one of the phrases that I often find myself saying is, we need to help them get out of the weeds. Now, for any of us who have ever been tangled up in weeds, we all know that it's usually easier said than done to untangle those weeds.
Yeah, first you have to recognize it's a weed, that you're in the weeds. That's some self-awareness there helps. Then you need to help people acknowledge that it's not life-giving, and finally something needs to replace the weed. So when we say weeds and seeds, we acknowledge there's a process leaders will navigate.
And our hope is that these weeds and seeds will help you give voice to them without shaming or blaming anyone when they happen, but instead simply acknowledge them so that you can have a conversation about them. Change can be explored, and you can work toward replacing that weed with a seed.
So the weeds are things to pluck up, get rid of. Seeds are the new life. Since we're in the season of Easter, that seems appropriate. It's also spring.
Yeah, and because it's spring and the time that we're literally sowing seeds, it's a good time to acknowledge the things that need to be plucked up and what needs to be planted. So what else would you like to offer, Tim, before we dive into the first weed and seed?
Sarah, part of the scripture that you were reading that's always been a challenge for me is that, oh, don't pull the weeds yet. Wait till the harvest, because pulling the weeds might also pull the wheat. So the whole point to our little seed and weed thing here is really about you being healthy enough to recognize when you are in the weeds and you are tangled up in the weeds, and then knowing how to respond. It's not just a matter of, I need to get out of the weeds. It's a matter of what takes place next as we take a step in ministry. So that's really what we're talking about.
Yeah, timing and process. As we share these, it might sound, and we'll do our best not to make it sound this way, but it might sound like, oh, you just replace it. Pull up one thing and it's automatically replaced with the other. But there's a process, and there's often time. There's conversations that are going to need to happen to move to those places. So if it sounds like it's an immediate replacement, that is not our intention.
Well, we've also tried to make it fun. So it's just
right.
Okay.
So we have some metaphors going on here. Okay, our first weed. Are we ready?
Yes.
Okay, our first weed is Cookie Cutter Crocus. The Cookie Cutter Crocus applies the same leadership approach to all experiences and interactions. They do not see contextual or situational differences. An example of this might be you experience a change of appointment, or you're receiving a new pastor, whatever side you're on in that. It might be that you're moving from a suburban church to a rural church, or your pastor has come from a suburban church and you are a rural church. Or maybe at the previous church, there was a staff and now you have volunteer and unpaid staff. Or this is a bit of an extreme example, but I'm being intentional in offering an extreme example. The Cookie Cutter Crocus would approach treating the toilet needing to be fixed in the same way as someone who has just lost a loved one or someone who needs pastoral care and they're in the hospital. There's not an understanding of different needs in leadership require different approaches. So how do you recognize the Cookie Cutter Crocus? There's a consistency, of course, to Cookie Cutter Crocus, but there's also a lack of emotional intelligence. At the extreme, their response or leadership is the same regardless of what the situation is. It can be awkward because you've experienced the same behavior, the same affect in different situations. So whether it was around conversations at a trustees meeting or a pastoral care need, there was the same affect and same behavior. And those are two very different conversations that are happening that often require a different approach in leadership.
So the seed that might be in response to Cookie Cutter Crocus is Leadership Lavendar. We see Leadership Lavendar as adaptive leadership, or being an adaptive leader. That leader would naturally evaluate the type of leadership needed in any scenario and provide and proceed appropriately. The leader understands the difference between adaptive and tactical and strategic leadership, and then knows when to use the different approaches. The bottom line is they're contextual in their core, and the people often describe them as courageous leaders. They can read the situation and they know how to adapt.
Is there an example that you might offer of Leadership Lavendar unfolding in ministry?
Sure. When there's oftentimes when we are in church meetings And there's a question about it, and it'll run everything from trustees, finance, to the Easter program, or how we're going to come in on Palm Sunday, or whatever. The tendency immediately is to try to approach those things in a tactical way. So, yeah, you've already mentioned the toilet. The toilet needs to be fixed. Okay, somebody needs to fix the toilet. That's a tactical piece. But when we're celebrating Easter, and maybe even more Palm Sunday, I mean, we've just celebrated Palm Sunday, and I'm thinking, when you read Mark's gospel, they didn't have palm branches. They actually used stuff they pulled out of the field and waved them. But yet we're going to read Mark's gospel and wave the palm branches. Isn't there a place there where we can actually experience the scripture in a better way? And that's a poor example, but that might be an adaptive way that we're adapting to the situation. I was a part of a Zoom meeting the other night with a panel of people, and the moderator of the panel, who was in Texas, and he's working with a group of people and the panel from across the country, and he lost power. So the panel is still discussing, and then all of a sudden they realize that the moderator is not there, and then he shows up again looking different on a different computer. And then he said, I had to go to a different computer, lost power. He could have sat there and said, I don't know what to do. I can't take care of this. I can't get this computer to work, whatever. He adapted to the situation with a different computer or phone or iPad or whatever. When it comes to individuals and our leadership, it's easy to stay in the weeds. In fact, it's more comfortable to stay in the weeds. But sometimes not only plucking the weeds, but cutting them down creates a whole new area of being able to lead. So I'm trying, Sarah, but those are the things that come to mind when I think about, we can leave things the way they are and say, it just doesn't work. I'm not cut out for this. Or we can step up and say, what's God trying to teach me in this situation, and how can I move forward in a different way?
Yeah, and this is more about the metaphor than it is about ministry. But if you've ever seen a lavender field, like they're beautiful, but the lavender, it grows in lots of different ways. And so listening to you give that example, for me, it was the visual of a lavender field that, yeah, there's going to be different approaches. Not all the lavender is going to look the same. Sometimes it's going to be adaptive leadership that's needed. Sometimes it's going to be that tactical that's needed. Sometimes it's going to be the strategic leadership that's going to be needed. But the lavender is present all the time. And that's the point of this one, that continuing to lead and keeping the different approaches to leadership at the forefront of your leadership and not getting lost in the weeds. Is there anything else that you would like to offer before we end this episode?
Absolutely not. Although when I say that, thank you for giving us clarity on Leadership Lavendar.
Thank you for joining us this week for the first episode in this series on ministry, weeds, and seeds. May Leadership Lavendar fill your week. I can't say that without laughing. So I just hope that little earworm sticks in your brain throughout the week and you continue to think about Leadership Lavendar. As a reminder, the show notes for this episode can be found at transformingmission.org/318. Next week, join us as we reveal the next set of weeds and seeds. And remember, who you are is how you lead. Bye for now.